Okay, so we left off where the Alter Rebbe is quoted the Gemara that there are five, and this is going to become very central to the Alter Rebbe's whole thesis, that there are five categories of Jews that the Gemara talks about. And the categories are two categories of tzaddikim, tzaddik v'tovlo, tzaddik v'ralo, the Beinani, which is the middle category, the intermediary, and then two categories of Rasha, the Rasha V'tovlo and the Rasha V'ralo. So how the Gemara speaks about it is completely different than how the Alter Rebbe is going to speak about it. The Gemara talks about it uses these terms figuratively, not literally. In other words, if a person has more mitzvahs than sins, that's a tzaddik. That's not the term tzaddik emes la'amitai. When we use the term tzaddik, it doesn't mean somebody who simply has more mitzvahs than sins. But the Gemara talks about it figuratively, not literally. And when Rabbi was teaching this Gemara to his students, in order to concretize it, to make it real, in order for them to understand what these categories are, he used himself as an example. And he said, Kagon ana beinani. For example, if you want to know I am a Beinani. Now, so the fact that Rabbi could say that, and this is where we ended off. Now, we have to understand who Rabbi was. Rabbi, when I mentioned this last week, Rabbi was one of the great Amoraim of the Talmud. And he was such so diligent in his Avodas Hashem and in his learning that the Malach HaMavos could not take his neshama, because he never stopped learning Torah. So he constantly repelled the Malach HaMavos. So when Rabbi said, Kagon ana beinani, all the students around the table, they just felt dejected. If he's the beinani, if our teacher who never stops learning, who clearly doesn't sin, if he's the beinani, then the rest of us are obviously Rasha. And that's exactly what Abaya answers him. Abaya answers him, if you're the Beinani, Lo shavat mar chai lekalberia. You don't allow anyone else to live. We're all in the category of Rishayim if you're the Beinani. So obviously, Rabba is not the Beinani. Obviously, Rabba is a tzaddik. However, the fact that Rabba could make such an error and think about himself as a Beinani, you could say, well, maybe he's being humble, but he's teaching Torah, so he has to be exact. He's not trying to be humble here. He's trying to teach them. He actually thought he was the Beinani. So just from that story alone, the Alter Rebbe says, we understand that the category of Beinani, it's not like tzaddik, Beinani, and Rasha. And Beinani's in the middle. It's more like tzaddik, Beinani, and Rasha. That the Beinani is actually incredibly close to the tzaddik, to such an extent that Rabbah could make such an error about himself. Why is any of this relevant to us? The Alter Rebbe is going to explain that amongst these categories, the category that all of us can strive to reach, the vast majority of us can strive to reach the category of Beinani. That is going to be the Alter Rebbe's thesis, that the tzaddik is not a category that most of us can attain. And it's not even our goal. We're not striving. The tzaddik is spiritual perfection. The tzaddik is somebody who doesn't sin, who no longer deals with any negativity, who no longer battles the Yetzer Hara that is trying to seduce them to anger or to jealousy or to taivas, whatever it may be. The tzaddik doesn't deal with any of that. The tzaddik has reached spiritual perfection. And again, as I mentioned last week, it used to be that was the goal. But comes the Alter Rebbe with a tremendous novel teaching and say, not only is that not the goal, but it's not even attainable for us. In order to grow anywhere spiritually, and this is going to be a theme, even though the Alter Rebbe never utilizes this word, but this is a theme throughout Tanya, that in order to grow spiritually, we have to be very cognizant of our own self. We have to have self-awareness, cognizant of ourselves, who we actually are. Understand, and self-awareness is not so common for lots of different reasons. We tend to not look at ourselves with an exact picture for lots of different reasons. Sometimes self-awareness is painful. A lot of times it's painful. So, but we can't grow. We can't begin to achieve our spiritual potential and the heights of spirituality and connection to Hashem that we have the possibility to achieve without actually being honest with where we are now. And I'm not saying only negatively, I'm saying to the contrary. We have to know where our flaws are, where our struggles are, what midas I particularly struggle with. And that again, those are not things that we enjoy contemplating and thinking about. But we also have to know what our strengths are, what our spiritual strengths are, what our emotional strengths are. Hashem created us, this package, this entire package that he calls the human being. Hashem created us with both areas that need improvement, areas that need refinement and rectification, and incredible spiritual, emotional, psychological strengths as well. And this, we have to know our strengths because we're meant to share those strengths with the world and affect and make a difference in the lives of others, utilizing the strengths that we have. If we don't recognize who we are and what we are in terms of our strengths, in terms of the spiritual keches that we have, we're never going to utilize them. And we certainly won't make the best of them. So self-awareness is critical when it comes to Avodas Hashem. Similarly, in terms of refining who we are and becoming the best versions of ourselves, every one of us, the vast majority of us, according to mystical ideology, not all Jewish ideology believes what I'm about to say, but the mystical branches of Judaism certainly do, thank you. The mystical branches of Judaism certainly do, and that is the concept of reincarnation. And in the mystical branches, which the Alter Rebbe is certainly in that branch, the thought is that there are very few neshama chadashas. There are very few new souls. Most of us, almost all of us, have been here multiple times before. And the reason why we come back, and oftentimes, and this is a whole shiur in and of itself, which I don't want to get sidetracked, but it's important to understand the reason why we come back is not happenstance. It's not coincidence. It's not punishment or anything like that. The reason why we come back is we all have various missions in this world. We all have the general mission of Dira B'Tachtona, making a dwelling place for Hashem in this world, through our Torah, through our mitzvahs, through making the world a better place, transforming the world, etc. We all have that general mitzvah. In addition to that, we have our own individual shlichus and our missions, our purposes, why we're here. One of those is to refine the midas of my nefesh bahamas, of my animalistic soul, which we're going to talk about. We haven't even gotten to the animal soul, but let's say our nature, what we consider our nature. You know, we all have the nature that we're born with, and our nature is comprised of good parts and negative parts. We all have that. The negative parts of our nature, whatever negativities we may be dealing with, anger, sina, kina, jealousy, taivas, whatever it may be. We all have our own individual yetzaharas. We all have our own individual animalistic souls and animalistic tendencies. And our job is to refine all of those, to uplift them, to elevate them. The midas that we struggle with in this world, the negativity that is strong within me, whatever that negativity is, that itself is a sign that is a midah, that is an attribute that needs to be refined and rectified and elevated. And we come back because we didn't do it, we didn't complete it in our previous Gilgul. So those attributes that I don't struggle with, let's say I don't struggle with anger or I don't struggle with taiva, that's because it was already refined in a previous Gilgul, in a previous incarnation. So if you want to know, well, what is my mission here? What do I have to refine? What do I have to rectify? It's the issue or issues, the negativity that exists within you that is still there, that you're still battling, that you're still struggling with. The fact that you're struggling with it, that's the sign. So all of us, the vast majority of us have come multiple times. And Each time we are working to strive to refine these attributes. We cannot begin to refine and rectify them until we pinpoint them in our own minds. It's not going to happen automatically. It takes, which is why we're here so many times, it takes real effort and real toil and real yagia. It takes real effort to rectify, to refine, to really engage and actually experience real change, inner growth. So many people just coast along the surface and never, and I'm talking about religious, Shomer Torah and mitzvahs, but never externally observant of everything, but never actually engage in real inner work, in real inner change. And says the Alter Rebbe, that's the goal. The goal is not to just coast by. The goal is not just to get through life and fulfill mitzvahs. The idea is that every mitzvah that we do, the Torah that we learn, it affects us, changes us, refines us. But that refinement cannot begin until we have the self-awareness and we're honest with ourselves of where we need to work and strive to actually transform that area that we need to work on. And the Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe is going to give us the tools to be able to do it. But what the Alter Rebbe cannot give us is awareness of ourselves. That we have to have. Okay. So Rabbi, with this tremendous self-awareness, yet calls himself a Beinoni. How could Rabbi call himself a Beinoni? So in order to understand what the Aveda of the Beinoni is, because remember, this Sefer, the Alter Rebbe called Sefer Shel Beinoni. This is the guidebook for the Beinoni, meaning all of us. The vast majority of us are in this category of Beinoni. But what does that mean exactly? Right now, it's just an empty word. What actually is a tzaddik? What actually is a rasha? If a tzaddik is somebody who never sins, and a rasha is somebody who sins, even one sin, he's separated from Hashem, he's moved himself away from Hashem. The moment he does tshuva, he's a tzaddik again. So who is this Beinoni? Where is this Beinoni? How is this Beinoni? What exactly is it? So this is what the Alter Rebbe is going to spend a lot of time defining, because it's really defining who we are. We are all the Beinoni. I'm just giving you the end of like chapter 13, where the Alter Rebbe says, we are all the Beinoni. That is us, but it helps us to know exactly where we're going. And so throughout these chapters of chapter 1 through sort of 12, as I said last week, none of this is going to be yet Aveda, the real work. It's all going to be the building blocks through which we can then engage in real Avodas Hashem once we have the knowledge of who we are, the makeup of our neshama, what our soul is made up of, the two-soul battle that's going on within us. The Alter Rebbe is going to delineate all of this, and these are all just knowledge that we can then access to utilize to engage in this spiritual journey. Okay, so let's jump back in. We're on Kagon Ana Beinoni, that line where Rabbi. Yeah.
I think in previous classes you just said that because they're tzaddikim, we most of us cannot attain the level of tzaddik. As much as we try, we'll never be a tzaddik. There are certain neshamas that were sent down to the world that could be a tzaddik. Most of us are not in that category. That's why the most we could strive for is Beinoni, which we'll learn what that is, instead of like trying to be a tzaddik and never getting there and being, oh, I'll never be a tzaddik. At least we could try to be a Beinoni.
It's true, but I think when you say that, you shouldn't say most of us, because I think you are in that category. The rest of us are the Beinoni. So it's very humble of you to say most of us, but we all know. Okay. And yes, to being married to a tzaddikus, that is a source that you constantly have a role model that is in front of you to help you spiritually and emotionally grow 100%. That I'm just saying the truth. This is emes. I'm like Rabbi, I'm teaching Torah. I have to be clear. So, okay. Can't exaggerate or be humble. Okay. So Rabbi says, Kagoin Ana Beinoni. We're like 14 lines up from the top, beginning of that line. It's like right in the middle of the page. Kagoin Ana Beinoni, says Rabbi, after he delineates all these categories, he says, for example, I am the Beinoni. Omer le Abaye, so Abaye, who was a tzaddik himself. Omer le Abaye says, if you're the Beinoni, literally the words mean you don't allow The master does not allow. Lei shavik mar means the master does not allow. Chai l'kolber, he doesn't allow any of us to live. He doesn't allow the rest of creation to live, because if you're the Beinoni, then the rest of us are Rishayim, and Rishayim are called Mason. So then we're all spiritually dead. It completely deflates all of us if you say you're the Beinoni. Like my wife says, one of us. What do you mean one of us? You're okay. Ulahavin calls that. And in order to understand all of this, these 5 categories, and what exactly the Beinoni is and what exactly the Tzaddik is, Lahavin calls that Be'er Hativ. In order to understand this very well, the Gam Lahavin Masha Omer Iyov. And also we have to understand a very difficult to understand pasuk in Sefer Iyov. That's quoted in Bava Basra, Perak Aleph. Iyov says as follows. Rabbeinu Shel Elam, he addresses Hashem. And he says, Rabbeinu Shel Elam, barasa tzadikim, barasa rishoyim. You created tzadikim and you created rishoyim. In other words, what Iyov is saying, it's what Iyov seems to be saying is, there really isn't bechira, that Hashem created tzadikim and he created rishoyim. We always thought we have free choice. And if it depends upon our own free choice and our own actions, whether we're a tzaddik or a rasha. But according to Iyov says you created tzaddikim, which seems to imply we have no bechira. It's just we are as Hashem created us. That's the antithesis of Judaism. There are certain theologies that, especially ancient theologies, but even in India, they have these theologies that you're born into at a certain level, at a certain caste, or whatever it may be, and you can never rise above. In Mitzrayim, this is exactly what they are. The Jewish people, the Bnei Yisrael, were the slave caste, and that's what they were destined to be for eternity. Your grandfather was a slave, your father was a slave, you're a slave, your children will be slaves. There is no escaping that or leaving that. So this seems to be what Iyov is saying in terms of our own ethical and moral behavior. Barasa tzadikim, barasa rishoyim. You created people who are already tzaddikim, and you created people who are rishoyim. They have no choice. That seems to be what Iyov is saying. V'hatzadik v'rasha loy ka'amar. But the Gemara says that there are certain things that are up to Hashem. There are certain things that Hashem does decree about us. In fact, most of the things in our life. This is a fascinating discussion in and of itself. Where do we actually have free choice? Because most of the free choice that we think we have, we actually don't have. Where we live, the job we take, who we marry, we think that's all our free choice. That is all divinely ordained. All of that is divinely ordained. It looks in our life like we chose that, but it's only because Hashem directed us to exactly where we need to be and directed those choices. Those were all divinely ordained. We don't really choose who we marry or where we live or what the house we have, etc. All of those things, Hashem directs the steps of man. The one area that we actually is not in the purvey of Hashem, the one area that is completely our choice is our moral and ethical behavior, our choices in how we behave. And this is what the Gemara says. You could say that Hashem controls a lot of things and decides a lot of things, but tzaddik v'rasha loy ka'amar. But you can't say that about Hashem, about whether we're a tzaddik or a rasha. That is completely in our bechira. So that is a contradiction to what Iyov is saying. You created tzaddikim, you created rishoyim. Do we have bechira? Of course, that's a fundamental pillar of Judaism, right? That is one of the pillars of our faith, that we have bechira chavshis. So how could Iyov, and that's exactly what the Gemara says, tzaddik v'rasha loy ka'amar. You can't say that Hashem determines our behavior. We are in control of our behavior. We determine it. So how could Iyov say, you created tzaddikim, you created rishoyim? Okay. And the author is going to answer all these questions throughout the next 13 chapters in giving us these building blocks of knowledge. The gam lahavin mahus madregas habeinani, and this is the key. What is the Beinoni? This entire Sefer is the Sefer Shel Beinoni. But what exactly is the Beinoni? Who is the Beinoni? It's certainly not somebody who has half sins and half mitzvahs. That's how the Gemara refers to a Beinoni. That's how the Talmud refers to it. But that's figuratively. It's not literally. It's clearly not. If Rabbi could say on himself that he's the Beinoni and he's trying to teach them Torah and be exact, clearly the Beinoni is not somebody that the scale is half and half. Rabbi was nowhere near half and half. He never stopped learning. So what exactly is this Beinoni? She'im came because if it was half and half. Then how could Rabba ever say about himself that he was a Beinoni? The fact that he could give himself that appellation, the fact that he could describe himself as being the Beinoni, tells us the Beinoni is actually much closer to the Tzaddik. The Neda, we know about Rabba, as I said before, Deloy Pasik Pumya Megirsa. His mouth never stopped learning Torah. To such an extent that the Malach HaMavos could not grab him, could not end his life here in this world. So if that's the case, if Rabba never stopped learning Torah, that means in his all this free time, he just learned. This was his entire life was Torah. Obviously, he wouldn't make the mistake to think that he had half sins in his life. I mean, he's being accurate. So clearly, the fact that he said that he's the Beinoni, clearly the Beinoni is somebody who's on a very lofty level. So what exactly is the Beinoni? And another question about the Beinoni. Who is he and what category is he in? Says the Alter Rebbe, at a time when a person sins, Nikra Rasha Gamor. At the time of sin, he's called a Rasha. He's moved himself away from Hashem. He's separated himself from Hashem. Ve'im achachach asa tshuva nikra tzaddik gamor. And if afterwards he does tshuva, he's a tzaddik. So if you sin, you're a Rasha. If you do tshuva and you have no sin, you're a tzaddik. So who's the Beinoni? What is the Beinoni? There doesn't seem to be any middle ground. You're either a Rasha or a tzaddik. So maybe you're going to think, well, maybe a Beinoni is somebody who does a lighter sin, a smaller sin, not a midoraisa, maybe a midrabanan. He says no. Even somebody who sins a midrabanan, who transgresses something that's midrabanan, that's also called a rasha. As the Gemara says, a perak kaima de Nida in chapter 2 of Yavamis, in the first chapter of Nida. And even if the person himself doesn't sin at all, but he has within the ability to prevent somebody else from sinning, and he doesn't do it, Nikar Rasha, he's also called a Rasha. So there doesn't seem to be a middle ground to define who the Beinoni is and what the Beinoni is. The kasha came b'kavachemer b'mavatal eze mitzvahs aseh she'ef shalei l'kaima, and how much more if a person refrains from fulfilling a positive commandment. Kamei kal she'ef shalei l'asik b'teira ve'ena oisik. More on the next page now, the page 5. Like for example, somebody who has the ability to learn Torah and doesn't do it. Sha'alav darsha rizal, that the sages say upon that person, ki dvar Hashem baza, that he hates the dvar Hashem because he's not engaged in Torah. He kares ti kares, that soul will be cut off, etc. Bupshita the mikra rasha to fema over isud rabbanan. So certainly somebody who doesn't fulfill a positive commandment, somebody who refrains from fulfilling a positive commandment, is certainly more of a rasha than somebody who transgresses a midrabanan. So the bottom line, the Alter Rebbe is trying to elucidate is that where is the Beinoni? There doesn't seem to be a middle category, a gray area. The im kain al korcha. So if it's true then that the Rasha is somebody who sins and the tzaddik is somebody who doesn't sin, if you sin one time, that's the Rasha, and then do tshuva, you're back to being the tzaddik. The im kain al korcha ha Beinoni ein bo yafilu avim b'tol Torah. So the Beinoni has no sin at all. Because the moment you sin, you're in the category of Rasha. So if that's the case, then isn't the Beinoni the tzaddik? Umishum hachi. But because the Beinoni does not sin, that's why that's why Rabbi thought maybe he's the Beinoni. Because the Beinoni also doesn't sin. So Rabbi was trying to be accurate. So clearly, from all of these Gemaras and Talmuds that the Alter Rebbe brought, that even if you sin one time, you're called the Rasha. And the fact that Rabba could call himself a Beinoni from both of those, the inference is clear that the Beinoni is incredibly similar to the tzaddik, that he has no sin at all. Well, if that's the case, how does the Beinoni differ? And how can the Alter Rebbe expect us to reach such a level of no sin whatsoever, of no manifest negativity whatsoever? I mean, we're human beings. right? Hashem created us as flawed, fallible human beings with all kinds of negativities and proclivities that are passionate within us. So how is it possible to reach a place where we could be called the Beinoni? And yet that's the journey of this entire Sefer. It is not only possible, but as we learned in the Sharblat of Tanya, the very introduction, it's not only possible to become the Beinoni, it's incredibly attainable for every one of us. If you have the right tools and the right knowledge, we can all become the Beinoni. And that's what the Alter Rebbe wants to teach us how to do. Okay, let's go a little bit further. In this, the fact that the Gemara refers to the Beinoni as somebody who's half and half, sort of the intermediate in between the Rosh and the Tzaddik, says the Alter Rebbe, somebody who is half and half is the Beinoni, and somebody who has one more mitzvah, the scale tips in one direction towards mitzvahs, that person's called the Tzaddik, says the Alter Rebbe, Hu Shem Hamushal. That is only figuratively speaking. It is not literal. It's only figurative le'inyan schar va'einish when it comes to reward and punishment in the Bezdin Shomaila. So the Bezdin Shomaila indeed measures. What's your measuring? The positive things that you've done and versus the negative things that you've done. If you have more positive than negative, then you win the Bezdin Shomaila court case, so to speak. You're tzaddik bedin. That's the tzaddik in the Gemara, but that's not the true spiritual, mystical meaning behind the tzaddik. When we say somebody like the Chafetz Chaim or the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a tzaddik, that's not what we're referring to, that he has more mitzvahs, more positive than negative. We're obviously referring to a lofty spiritual madrega. But the Gemara refers to a tzaddik just figuratively. So the Alter Rebbe wants to make that clear. Don't make the mistake that when you see in other places the tzaddik referred to as figuratively, that's not what we're talking here. Here in Tanya, here in this journey, we're using actual literal terms. So the Alter Rebbe is just forewarning us that other places in Jewish liturgy, the terms are utilized, but they're not meant literally. They're meant more figuratively. Shem HaMushal, which means figurative. Le'inyan schar v'einish, in terms of reward and punishment. Because we are judged after the majority of our actions. If our majority of our actions are good, then we have a positive judgment. The majority of our actions are negative, then we have a negative judgment. Umikre tzadik bedinai. We're called a tzadik bedin, that we won the court case, so to speak. Ma'achar shezeicha bedin, because we won the court case. But avola inyan amitias shema tayar. But when it comes to the real, true definition of what a tzaddik is, and there are gradations of tzaddik, just as there are gradations of Beinoni, and there are a myriad of gradations of tzaddik and Beinoni. When it comes to the true definition, that is not the true definition. The true definition, Amar Rizal, as the sages say, tzaddikim yetzer tov sheftan. Tzaddikim only have a Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Tov is the only force that motivates their actions. In other words, a tzaddik is somebody who has completely transformed his negativity, that he no longer has any negativity. That all those inner battles, all that inner anger, jealousy, lashon hara, whatever it may be that exists within, the tzaddik has completely vanquished. Doesn't deal with it at all. It had completely different Aveda than the rest of us. No longer is engaged in Avedis Habirurim, no longer is engaged in elevating and refining and rectifying midas. The tzaddik only has a Yetzer Tov now. Yetzer Tov Sheftan. He's only motivated by his Yetzer Tov. Shenemar, as David HaMelech says, this is David HaMelech after he did tshuva, after the story with Bathsheba, he did tshuva, Libi cholol bekirbi. My heart is empty within me. What is David HaMelech saying, my heart is empty within me? What he means is, she'ein lo yetzer hara, that David HaMelech completely, in a state of tshuva, completely vanquished, defeated his yetzer hara, so that it is no longer a motivating force in his consciousness at all. Ki hargu b'tainas. He killed his yetzer hara through tshuva and through fasting. He was able to completely destroy and transform his yetzer hara. But that's a tzaddik. That's a true tzaddik. No negativity, no yetzer hara, no animalistic tendencies, no negative whatsoever. That is a madrega that most of us will be unable to reach. I will call me shaloi hagia madrega zu, somebody who is like the vast majority of us who has not reached this level. Even if he has more mitzvahs than sins, which is probably most of us, we have more mitzvahs than sins, but nevertheless, if we have not completely vanquished this negativity within us, we are not at the level of tzaddik. So the tzaddik, by definition, by true definition, amitias, not shema mushal, not figuratively, the tzaddik has reached complete and total spiritual perfection. No negativity at all. There are individuals who reach this level. There are. But they're few and far between. They're a handful in every generation. And their Aveda is completely different than ours. Their Aveda is one of teaching and guiding and inspiring. They're not engaged in Avedas HaBirurim like the rest of us are. Let's just finish off, and we'll finish off in another few sentences. And therefore, since this category of person is so rare, and this is what the Chazal say in the Medrash. Hashem saw that the tzaddikim, Hashem, who could see past, present, and future all as one. Hashem looked at the entirety of the history of all of the world and saw that the tzaddikim are very, very few. There's going to be only a very few. So Amid v'shalasan b'kol dor v'dor. So Hashem put a few tzaddikim in every generation to inspire us, to guide us, to be a living example of everything that we're supposed to be. But they're very, very few. As it says, tzaddik yesod elam. The tzaddik is the yesod elam. He is the foundation of the world. He is our guide. The tzaddik is the one who inspires us. The tzaddik is the one who shows us everything that we can be. But they are very, very, very few and far between. So that means that's not our goal. We're not striving for spiritual perfection. And let's not set ourselves up for a goal that we cannot reach, because obviously, as we said last week, setting ourselves up for a goal that we cannot reach will just result in dejection, and we'll give up on the whole journey. So the Alter Rebbe says, and this was such a novel teaching and controversial in the times of the Alter Rebbe, that not only can we not become the tzaddik, it's not even our goal. It's not even achievable. It's not attainable for the vast majority of us. Our goal is to become the Beinani. We don't yet know what that Beinani is. We haven't yet defined it, but we will. Okay, another few lines. Bir ha'inyan al pima sha'omer Rab Chaim Vital. So now the Alter Rebbe now begins the explanation. We ask all the questions, and now the Alter Rebbe begins the explanation. And he says the explanation of this begins and is founded on a teaching from Rab Chaim Vital. Who was Chaim Vital? Chaim Vital was the preeminent student of the Arizal, of Isaac Luria. All of the Alter Rebbe's sort of Hasidus and mystical leanings and teachings all originate in the branch of Kabbalistic thought from the Arizal. So a lot of the Alter Rebbe's teachings are going to mirror teachings from the Arizal that the Arizal just spoke about them very briefly, and the Alter Rebbe elucidates them for the average everyday person. Because before the Alter Rebbe really came and brought this knowledge to the world, this knowledge existed, but it only existed by a handful of people in every generation. And so when the Arizal taught it, he taught it very much in shorthand, because those tzaddikim who needed it understood the shorthand, but the rest of us would not understand the shorthand. The Alter Rebbe took the Arizal shorthand and actually brought it into language that you and I can relate to, that you and I can actually incorporate and understand. And that itself was so controversial that the Alter Rebbe took knowledge that for thousands of years was only handed down from a handful of tzaddikim to a handful of tzaddikim, and decided, you know what? It's time to break the barriers, and it's time to give this knowledge to everyone, to the regular Jews, to all of us. And at that time, in that time period, that idea was so controversial that the Jewish Organized Jewry at that time, organized Orthodox Jewry at that time was incredibly opposed to it. This is not knowledge for the masses. This is only knowledge for the great spiritual giants. And says the Alter Rebbe, we're so far away from Har Sinai. And after all of the pogroms and false messiahs and all the difficulties that the Jewish people have gone through, we are in such a low state spiritually that we need this now to survive spiritually in the world. We need this knowledge. All of us need this knowledge. And they were the rest of the organized Jewish world at that time was virulently opposed to such an extent that they went to the non-Jewish authorities, the anti-Semitic Tsarist authorities, and accused the Alter Rebbe of treason so that they would imprison the Alter Rebbe. And because they felt that the Alter Rebbe was going to start a heretical movement with this Kabbalistic knowledge, mystical knowledge, that would take so many Jews off of the path of Yiddishkeit. And they felt the Alter Rebbe was a real danger, that this knowledge, exposing us to this knowledge, was incredibly dangerous for all of us, was the thought. And therefore, they went to these Tsarist authorities. They said the Alter Rebbe was engaged in treason because the Alter Rebbe was sending money at that time to Jewish settlers in Eretz Yisrael who were impoverished. And Eretz Yisrael at that time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, that was at war with Russia. So the Alter Rebbe was sending money, kaviyachol, so to speak, to the enemy. And the Alter Rebbe was thrown into prison for that. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But what we are about to learn was incredibly controversial, that we should have this knowledge. So bottom line is, just to conclude for today, so this entire idea, this entire path of the Alter Rebbe is going to be based on Reb Chaim Vital, Zal b'Shar HaKedusha, what he taught in Shar HaKedusha. Chaim Vital, as I said, was the preeminent student of the Arizal, and most of the teachings from the Arizal that we have today come from Chaim Vital. The Arizal did not write them down. He just taught them. Chaim Vital wrote them down, and we have them from Chaim Vital. So Be'etz Chaim, Shar Nun, Perek Beis, and he gives these two different where Reb Chaim Vital speaks about this in Shar Kedusha in the Sefer Eitz Chaim, and we're just going to stop here in this next sentence because the entire Tanya is going to be based upon this next sentence. The L'Kol Ish Yisrael, that every single Jew, doesn't matter, from the loftiest Moshe Rabbeinu to the lowliest Rabbi Simon and everyone in between, the Kol Ish Yisrael, Echad Tzadik v'Echad Rasha, Yesh Shtei Neshamas. This is going to be the foundation of our psychology, our spirituality. This is going to be the foundation of so much that every single Jew, whether it's tzaddik or rasha or everyone in between, every single Jew has two souls. We think of ourselves as we have a soul. We have a body and a soul. We actually have two souls. And these two souls play totally different roles in our psychology, in the way that we think, in the way that we act, in the way that they motivate us, etc. And it is the two souls within us, the tension between these two souls, and the battle between these two souls, which is constantly going on within us, which we're going to talk about. This is where our real Avodah begins, with understanding these two souls and what our default is, because one soul is dominant and one is dormant, and we all sort of have a default. And then what our real Avodah is vis-a-vis these two souls, and how we can actually empower the godly soul within us and weaken the animalistic soul within us, which we're going to talk about in Mir Tzashem next week. So we're going to continue chapter 1. We now began the two-soul system. We're going to begin what these two souls are, what they're made up of spiritually, what they're composed of, how they motivate us, how they affect us, how they affect our psychology and our mind and our actions, and how we can actually empower the positive soul within us and weaken the animalistic or negative soul within us as well. So Emir Tzashem will continue the journey next week. Emir Tzashem, we'll see everybody, and let's all strive to be the best version that we can be of ourselves. Thank you so much, everybody.